Welcome to this week's episode of Saulcast. I'm your host, Adam, and my co-host, Gil, who just happens to be my brother as well. We are going to be talking about Season 4, Episode 1 of Better Call Saul. It's a long-awaited season premiere entitled Smoke. We loved it. We have lots of predictions and discussion about it as we recap this week's episode, and I know you'll enjoy hearing us talk about it as much as we enjoyed discussing. First, let's just talk about what we thought about the way Season 3 kind of wrapped up and everything that happened in general. So we just watched that recap. I think some of the most interesting points that stuck with me, especially things that I forgot about in the years since that happened, were the whole setup that Saul used with the insurance, the malpractice insurance, to embarrass Chuck and further piss him off, which led to him getting kicked out of the firm finally. What was odd to me, I think, was that was the final straw. Like, he'd been such a pain in the ass the whole time with his electricity problems, and every time he comes in, they have to turn all the lights off, and everyone in the meetings has to turn in his phones. But it was the fact that his malpractice insurance rates going up. That was the trigger for Hamlin to say, all right, you got to retire.
Right. Well, that was also after Chuck embarrassed himself in court when Jimmy tricked him into having the battery in his pocket. Right. So Chuck was arguing the whole time that his fear of electricity was a real physical ailment. And to prove that it wasn't, Jimmy had Huel, or I think that was the guy's name, right?
Yeah, Huel.
Sneak one of the best cameos so far, but had him sneak the battery into Chuck's pocket. So the whole time he was giving his testimony, didn't realize it was there. Then it was revealed, and once it was proven in front of everybody that it was all in his head, the whole fear of electricity thing, he started ranting and raving, sounded like a crazy person. And that was, I think, the first time it was made public that he had this problem. So I don't think it was exactly that the insurance rates going up was the last straw, but it was immediately after that public humiliation for the firm.
Right. So it was a lot of things kind of building up all at once for him, and he got overwhelmed.
Right.
What I found interesting about that court scene was it seems like that's when even Chuck, I think, became convinced at that point that the problem was in his head. And it's funny that if you were to think about it in advance, you might have the thought that the only thing that could convince him that it was in his head was if it was decreed by a court of law, given how much respect he has for the system.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah. What do you think of that as an ending for the character of Chuck?
I thought it was fitting at the time as I was watching it unfold. At no point did I feel like my suspension of disbelief was broken or feel like it was unrealistic. It was dramatic and kind of hyper real in the same way that Breaking Bad was, where a lot of improbable things happen, but things that are still conceivable and probable in the sense of how the characters operate.
Right. Yeah, I think it was a logical end for him. It's sad and depressing, but we also know where Jimmy is in Breaking Bad. And as far as we know, I guess we don't know for sure that none of these characters are still around. For all we know, in between scenes of seeing Saul Goodman in Breaking Bad, he's hanging out with Kim. It seems unlikely, but maybe she's there somehow. But it feels like most of these characters aren't around anymore. So I'm sort of watching the show assuming there's going to be all sorts of tragedies as one after another these characters leave his life. So I guess it was not a shock to me that Chuck ended in some tragic way. And I don't know, whenever I watch Better Call Saul, when I was watching Breaking Bad, I feel like the creators and the writers of the show have the show for them is partially an exploration of morality, and I always wonder, what are they trying to say by what they're doing here? Like Breaking Bad, I think they were casting a moral judgment on Walt and saying what he's doing is wrong, and his ego and his hubris took him to a bad place. What does it say about Chuck? I don't know if they're necessarily making any statement about Chuck. The show is about Jimmy, and he's going to suffer I think it was more about showing Jimmy the human consequences to his actions. He did something. There's a direct line from what Jimmy did that got Chuck to commit suicide. So I think this is an instance where it was less about Chuck and more about Jimmy in terms of what the show is trying to say.
Exactly. I agree. And I think it's similar in Breaking Bad to how people's actions would have real consequences. You can't fake reality or be dishonest and expect that the dishonesty could exist in a vacuum. You know, that you could have your cake and eat it too. And you saw a similar thing with Jane in Breaking Bad when her father allows after Jane dies of the heroin overdose, and Walt was complicit in allowing it to happen when he could have prevented it because he was watching her die at the time. And then her father, the air traffic controller, allows two planes to collide, and you have hundreds of deaths right over Albuquerque. Like, that is obviously kind of fantastical and extremely unlikely, but in the rules of the universe of Breaking Bad, it's saying even if an action of yours has a consequence that seems totally just an accident and a matter of probability, in the world of Breaking Bad, it's sort of karma. It's kind of a real consequence. And I do think it sends some kind of message about morality.
Yeah. And those fantastical elements, they also use them sparingly, and they don't use them to progress the plot. If Walt got stuck in some situation and you were like, how the hell is he going to get out of this? And then something ridiculous happens that frees him, that would be frustrating. But they use the fantastical elements to show two planes collide. So just to an absurd degree, there are consequences to your actions. Or Gus Fring, when he gets blown up and he walks out with half his face gone, pretty unlikely he would survive long enough to walk out and adjust his tie before he falls down. But it's used purely to create that lasting image. So they're making a point with it. They're not using it to progress the plot. And I think that's why we sort of let them do it. Right.
Yeah. They sort of make points that are emotionally true by using these kind of, like we said, fantastical elements. And like you said, we're fine with it because it doesn't become an important plot point. And I would make a similar argument that I'm making about Breaking Bad, which is that maybe it has some kind of causal effect on the way the plot progresses, but it could just as easily, things could just as easily have gone the way that they did, even if that didn't happen, through much more realistic means. So instead of considering it like, too unrealistic and therefore it kind of breaks my belief in the story, instead I just see it as that was a kind of a cool artistic decision. It had an interesting impact on the way I felt about the story, and it didn't take me out of it. And so similarly, that's how I feel about the elements like that in Better Call Saul.
Yeah. Anything else you noticed in season 3 recap?
Let's see.
I'll say one thing for me. This is just a minor plot detail, but the season 4 episode 1 opener, the black and white section, starts with Jimmy passed out, and it seems like that was actually a continuation from last season's opener, where that ended with him fainting. I just didn't realize that it was a direct continuation.
Right. Yeah, I actually kind of forgot what the previous season opener was like. So I actually forgot that it was a direct continuation. But now that you mention it, I do remember that. And I was also thinking about that scene and whether there's any remote sense that was supposed to remind us of Walt's collapsing scene when he was working at the car wash in Breaking Bad. If so, I think it's more just, even if there was any intentional parallel there, I don't think it was meant to imply that there's anything seriously wrong with Saul, who's now under the pseudonym of Gene.
Yeah.
I think, maybe it was meant to just show that this is, the beginning of some new transformative thing happening in his life the same way that it was in Walt's case, but I don't think it's saying he has a serious illness or something. I don't think anyone is saying that, but...
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, maybe since we're already talking about the opening, maybe we just jump right into that.
Yeah.
What do you think while I was watching the opening, I was wondering the same thing I was wondering during last season's opening. So, I mean, first off, I love the openers. Every time they do them, they're so artistically well done. Gene is such an understated character that barely speaks, but I feel like it's such a acting opportunity for Bob Odenkirk, and he does such a great job, especially because you see Gene, and then the rest of the episode, you're watching Jimmy, who's acting so differently. And he does such a great job as Gene, communicating his constant anxiety and fear of being discovered. But part of me wonders, what is the purpose of these scenes? I get the purpose the first time they do it because it sets up where the series is heading. It does give you some new information. But this opener in season 4, I enjoyed it on a visceral level. But I again ask myself, what new information did we get from the season 4 opener? We already knew he was paranoid. I guess maybe we're learning his health is a little bit worse than we thought, though we already knew that he wasn't taking care of himself. Season 1 opener established that he's essentially seems to be sort of an alcoholic. So I don't know. What did you think of that?
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. It's like, where are they going with this? Are these scenes going to become more frequent as the show progresses? Because I can't imagine how complex or deep of a story they could tell us through just a few minute segments at the beginning of each season, unless they're going to have 10 seasons of this. Mm-hmm. So I don't know precisely what angle they're working with these, mm-hmm. but I did enjoy it a lot. And I felt that this opener, what it highlighted to me I think it was the most tense opener that we've seen. That was like one of the most tense moments in the entire show, I felt, especially when he's in the cab and the cab driver starts looking at him. And I'm pretty sure he did recognize him. I don't think it was Saul just being paranoid. I'm sure that Saul Goodman's face was plastered on the news and that he's a wanted person back in New Mexico. And I really think that guy recognized him. I think it's possible that the openers will follow along this track of maybe he gets exposed and who knows what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe that's all in his head.
Mm-hmm. Let's recap what happened in the actual opener. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot there, but basically, Gene, the older post-Breaking Bad Jimmy character, passes out, wakes up in the hospital. They tell him everything's okay. On his way out, this is where I think the bulk of the scene took place. There's about 2 minutes where he's on his way out of the hospital, and the woman at the front desk stops him and says the computer system, I think, wasn't accepting his driver's license number. So she asks him for his social security. You can tell this makes him very anxious and paranoid because he has a fake identity. Maybe the computer is, maybe something got flagged and they're gonna figure him out from here. So he's slowly giving her the social security number. It still doesn't work. You can see he's contemplating, do I just leave while she's trying to get this from me? Anyway, it turns out it was just she put in an O instead of a 0. Everything turned out fine. From there, he leaves. He gets in his cab, and he notices that the cab driver has hanging off of his mirror one of those, what are those things called? The fresh
air freshener.
An air freshener that's from Albuquerque. So that, I think, is what initially sets off his paranoia. While they're driving, the cab driver keeps looking in the mirror, like awkwardly long eye contact. So you can tell that Gene feels like this guy maybe recognizes him as Saul. Maybe this is somebody that knows his old identity. Eventually, he gets dropped off sooner than his actual destination. He's like, you can just drop me off here, because he just wants to get out of the car. And then I believe that's where it ends, right?
Pretty much, yeah. He just kind of gets out, walks down the sidewalk a little bit in kind of a rushed fashion. He looks back and sees that the taxi is still just sitting there. Mm-hmm. And in my mind, I'm wondering, is that guy calling the police right now?
Yeah.
And I bet you saw Gene is wondering that too. But
it's
yeah,
possible if this was so this scene was a direct continuation of last season. You'd think next is season 5, right? That's getting pretty close to the length of Breaking Bad. So if they have an end game in mind, who knows? Maybe the next scene is that guy calling the cops. If that guy was from Albuquerque and there was publicity around Saul Goodman, very possible that he recognized him.
Yeah, I think so. And so we could see, because so far the show as a whole, it doesn't feel like all that much has happened, right? So if I had to give him my overall summary of what's been going on, it's Saul, who at this point is Jimmy, trying to get a career in law, but he struggles between wanting to play like the straight and narrow path versus his slip in Jimmy ways, because he knows all these ways to mess with the system and exploit it. and get by through this easier path. And sort of the biggest climax that's happened so far is his brother's suicide. But overall, there's been far less plot progression in the way that Breaking Bad has had. It's been a lot more just character exploration. And so when we say we're already in season 4, and you mentioned that Breaking Bad was only 5 seasons, it kind of just, I never thought about that, but it just hit me like we're pretty far along already in this show. And I wouldn't be surprised if big things start happening.
Right. Yeah, I'll say before we move off of the opener, I'll just make one prediction, which is that I definitely think they're going to spend more time in the post-Breaking Bad universe in the later seasons. Maybe it's the last 2 or 3 episodes take place in the Gene world. But my specific prediction, is that at some point we'll be watching the black and white scene. It's going to fade to color, and then the rest of the series will take place in post-Breaking Bad world.
I could definitely see that happening. And I do have one last thought on the opener, and I touched on it before about possible parallels between Gene and Walt in Breaking Bad.
Yeah.
And these could just be coincidences, but I remember in Breaking Bad how many things were going on that could be coincidences, but it could be intentional. It's hard to tell what the writers mean. But what I'm noticing, not only with the parallel between Gene passing out and Walt passing out in that first episode, but also in both phases when that happened, you have Walt, who's this like meek, mild-mannered guy who can't really stick up for himself and is sort of kind of constantly on just anxious and not really doing much with his life. And at the same time, you have Gene who, and they both have mustaches, which is not a huge deal, but again, like it does provoke a little bit more potential similarity between them. And you have Gene who, again, he not by choice, but he has to be kind of meek and mild-mannered and on edge and not able to really have a grandiose personality of any kind.
Right.
So I do see some similarities. It could just be things I'm noticing that weren't necessarily intentional, but either way, it's sort of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So
agreed. Interesting.
Yes. So then after the opener, we see Jimmy and Kim get a call from Howard. I think he leaves them a message or something. No, Jimmy's like, if it's something important, they'll leave a message or whatever, or they'll call back. And then you hear a very concerned sounding Howard telling them that it's about Chuck. And basically in the next scene, you see them at the ruins of Chuck's house. You see a coroner's van, and how the first thing that happens is Howard is like, Jimmy, don't come look in the coroner's van or see the remains or anything, which implies that Howard did see Chuck's charred body. Mm-hmm. And knows that it's something Jimmy does not need to see.
Right.
So that was pretty dark.
Couple things there. One thing that you skipped over, not really a plot element, but just a really cool visual effect that opened it. I think they start with the smoke or from the flame from Chuck's house, and then you see kind of pieces of ash that are sort of lit up, and they float into the next scene, and you see them float over Jimmy's bed while he's sleeping, which I thought was just a really cool setup for that scene.
Yeah, that was nice. That was well done.
And then the point you mentioned where Hamlin stops Jimmy from looking, the moment you see the coroner van is such a gut punch and such a great way of revealing to Jimmy what happened. Such a clever way of communicating that. We already knew it, but it's still, because you're experiencing it at the same time as Jimmy, it really is such an emotional moment when you see it says coroner on the back of that van.
Yeah, it really makes it feel real, and you have to think that at that point it's Jimmy probably knew already what he was walking into, I would imagine. But at that point it's just an abstraction, and then when you see the van, it's like that's kind of as real as it gets. Mm-hmm. And so you I think in that same scene you then have Jimmy talk about how he noticed all of these electronics tossed out of the house, like in the backyard. And he says that the firemen didn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
So Jimmy already knows, okay, Chuck must have been in bad shape. He must have been freaking out, got rid of all this stuff, even though he knew that just like 5 days earlier, Chuck was doing surprisingly well and like not showing any major signs of his like electromagnetic disease.
Mm-hmm. Right. And Jimmy would have only been able to interpret, seeing all the appliances in the yard, the only way Jimmy would know to interpret that as Chuck having relapsed is by Jimmy having had the close relationship that he'd had with Chuck in the past, from taking care of him, from being close with him. That's how he knows, what that means. So I think that adds some poignancy to it. And it's also just adds to the horribleness of the situation for Jimmy to realize that Chuck's last days must have been extremely unpleasant and just full of anxiety and paranoia and just all the things that Chuck was suffering from climaxed in those last few days.
Right. Yeah, and Jimmy doesn't really have a very strong reaction to it. You don't see him cry or anything like that. He kind of maybe puts his head in his hands or seems he becomes sort of muted and doesn't talk very much, but he has very he doesn't really show much emotion throughout the episode about this.
Mm-hmm.
What do you
Which
make
I
of
think
that?
is, yeah, I mean, so you finish season 3 and you wonder what's Jimmy's reaction going to be, because how often do we see him face real consequences, real tragedy? And I think we don't really get an interesting reaction until the end of the episode. I think a muted reaction is perfectly natural. I don't think everybody reacts to something horrible with this loud, in-your-face, crying or something very visible. Especially men, I think, if they're around other people, they might try and just subdue what they're feeling. So I don't think you can read too much into Jimmy's reaction immediately, because I think even a natural reaction to somebody dying, it might look exactly how it looked for Jimmy. I don't think it necessarily says anything about his... Well, I don't think it says anything unusual about his character or about his relationship with Chuck. Like I said, until you get to the end of the episode.
Right. Yeah, that sounds like a fair assessment to me. So I think that's about it for that first scene. I think shortly thereafter, there's a scene where Jimmy's back home with Kim. They get a call from Howard, and he wants to go over the obituary plans that Howard wrote. And so Howard starts reading it. Jimmy's clearly uninterested, or at least just not up for the task right now of listening to that.
Right.
And so as Howard's reading off just all of these accomplishments that Chuck had, graduating from UPenn and going to law school and his dedication to the law and everything like that, Jimmy just kind of puts the phone down and walks away. And Kim can hear that Howard is still talking, so Kim goes over and picks up the phone and just kind of says, yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah. What other show would think of a way to have... So you've got Jimmy, that he's been living in Chuck's shadow for his whole life. He's sick of hearing about his accomplishments and all that. What other show would think of such a clever way that after that character's death, now Jimmy has to sit there and just listen to basically an end-to-end recap of every good thing that Chuck has done in his life? Such a brilliant setup and totally believable. The way they've set up... What's his name? Hamlin?
Yeah, that's his last name. His first name's Howard.
Howard.
I always forget
totally believable that Howard would call and think it and read the entire obituary over the phone to Jimmy. I totally buy that, and emotionally it works so well. Yeah,
it works really well, and Howard is doing sort of the respectful thing, and he thinks he's, it seems like a pretty normal thing to do, and I doubt it occurred to Howard that Jimmy is gonna not enjoy hearing all these good things about Chuck, despite whatever strain that their relationship had. But what's interesting about Howard is that he has this combination of seeming kind of robotic or like superficial in a corporate kind of businessy sort of way. Like he's got this charisma that seems not necessarily fake, but not necessarily genuine either. But at the same time, he is that way the entire show. You never see him really break that at all. Basically, I see his character as, so far we have no evidence as far as I can recall, we have no evidence to believe he's anything other than what he appears to be, which is a fairly well-meaning character who's balancing a lot of annoying stuff that shouldn't even be on his plate. He's trying to just run a successful law firm, and he seems extremely competent, but he just has some stuff to deal with because of the whole Chuck and Jimmy issue that just should not be a concern of his remotely. Mm-hmm. And so I actually feel kind of bad for him.
Yeah, he was a character that started off, you think, very uninteresting. He's just the D-bag guy putting Jimmy down for seemingly no reason. Then you find out that he was doing all of that on Chuck's behalf, and he felt sort of caught in the middle. He actually liked Jimmy and was sort of forced to treat him poorly and not allow him, if I remember correctly, basically not help him or encourage him in any way to move forward in his law career. And all of that was at Chuck's behest. So you feel bad for him. I do remember, I think, at least one point in the show where I felt like Howard was sort of crossing the line. And I don't remember the exact details of it, but he was treating Kim poorly. Remember, he had her like working in the basement and was sort of punishing her. The thing is, I can't remember exactly why, but I remember feeling like he wasn't totally justified in treating her that way.
Yeah, I can't remember the details of that either, but I do remember it almost felt like hazing.
Yeah. I'm going to put that down as a follow-up because we have to have our... on the next episode, we can cast our proper moral judgment on the character of Howard and see, does he pass muster?
Yeah, this will be like our Howard tracking meter because it's easy to not pay much attention to him as a character, but I think the show is too thoughtful for us to kind of just ignore him.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
So that kind of wraps up the scene with the obituary. Moving on now this is when things get kind of fun. So now we see Mike getting his payment from Madrigal for his security consultant role. Do you remember what he did for them in the prior season?
For Madrigal Security?
Well, so he gets paid as a security consultant, but really it's Gus was paying him for something that Mike did on his behalf. I remember they met in like a parking garage and he was given some goons to work with. I just forget kind of the details, but Gus did some criminal work for them.
Right.
And he gets paid by Madrigal he gets like $10,000 or $11,000. And the invoice said it was for a role as like, quote, security consultant, something like that.
Right. That was when he was, I think what you're talking about, the quote unquote criminal act. Oh no, I put that in quotes. It was criminal activity. But wasn't that when he got the cocaine onto the truck? So, what's his name? The guy that sits in the wheelchair.
Uncle Tio.
Yeah, Uncle Tio. So he could get his drug runners, so they would be caught at the border. He got the coke onto their truck. So basically he was helping Gus and taking their competition out. I think that's what Gus was paying him for. Right,
yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, and he got him, right, he got the guy caught at the border. Okay, so Mike gets paid for that. He did a good job there. And I think Mike is just like looking for more work to do. He quits his... Did he quit the parking lot job?
Yeah, that was this episode.
Yeah, so he quits, and his pal reminds him that the boss wants his windbreaker back.
Right.
Which just adds a little bit of a kind of a demeaning aspect to his last day there. But I think he doesn't really care because he just had a big payday, and he has this awesome plan to become a full-time, what I think is his plan to become a full-time Madrigal employee. Mm-hmm. So I have a ton of fun watching scenes from pretty much any show. It doesn't even have to be a good show or a good movie, but scenes where someone is scheming and they're planning something, especially if it involves disguises and stuff like that. So I had a great time seeing what Mike ended up doing with sneaking into the Madrigal facility. So to kind of recap what happened is we come back for the commercial and we see some random dude in his car. He says something to his kid about just being safe riding the bike. And my mind was going crazy trying to figure out what might be happening there. I even recalled a scene from Breaking Bad where someone in a like Narcotics Anonymous group or something talks about how he was high on cocaine and backed out of his driveway and ran over and killed his daughter. And I was like, maybe this is what's happening. Who knows what could be going on? And it turns out it's just a random magical employee. His car won't start. We don't know why. He opens his briefcase and is looking frantically for, not that frantically, but he can't find something. He calls in and says he's going to be late. We still don't really know what's going on, but we can start to piece it together when we see Mike waltzing into Madrigal wearing that guy's employee badge. And then you realize, okay, Mike somehow disabled this guy's car and stole his badge, which was just awesome.
Yeah. And then once Mike's in there, he's basically running around the place and finding all their security flaws.
Right. He's waltzing around like he owns the place. He has a fun conversation about there's some guys in the break room grabbing donuts or whatever, debating who would win in a fight, like Bruce Lee or was it Muhammad Ali?
Muhammad Ali, yeah.
Yeah, and they're debating that, and one guy is like Bruce Lee could just sweep him, by the legs, and Mike butts in and goes, "Does he have a gun?"
Yeah, yeah. A few things that jumped out to me here. First one is complete coincidence. That same day I watched this episode of Better Call Saul, I was listening to an old episode of Joe Rogan, and they were having, I think, the exact same debate. Or it might not have been Muhammad Ali versus Bruce Lee, but it was Bruce Lee versus basically any modern day heavyweight MMA fighter. And it was almost a play-for-play same conversation.
That's pretty funny.
And generally, the whole, all of the Mike stuff in this episode was really funny, which I think is unusual. Usually it's the reverse, right? The Jimmy stuff is where you get a lot of the humor, and then it gets a little bit more serious, more tension, more action with the Mike stuff. This episode was kind of reversed, and I wonder if that was partially intentional by the writers. All of the Jimmy stuff was going to be more subdued and down this episode because you're dealing with the aftermath of Chuck's death. So maybe they intentionally amped up the humor, and it felt very natural in the Mike storyline so they could kind of balance it out.
I agree. I think that's something the writers are great at, is working comedic relief in such a natural way where you would never call this or Breaking Bad. You would never say it's a comedy, and yet I laugh out loud pretty much every episode. Mm-hmm. There's always something. And what's great about Mike is he's so competent. He's so good at what he does that as he's waltzing around Madrigal, this criminal enterprise and sneaking around, he's casually he opens the box to look for donuts. He doesn't see one that he likes. He closes it. He signs the birthday card or the birthday card and all this stuff. And nothing bad's going to happen. Like, I felt pretty confident he's not going to get caught. I wasn't nervous. It was kind of a nice relief to just watch someone competent doing something so funny and just walking around and, you're not nervous. You're just enjoying watching this thing unfold. Mm-hmm. So then
there's just something, no, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's always funny to watch somebody get away with stuff just because they're acting like they belong and they're acting confident. And that stuff works in real life. And Mike is just a pro at it. And it was just hilarious to watch.
Yeah, so I really got a kick out of that scene. And then you see, he's walking around with the clipboard taking note of all the security flaws. He goes down into some warehouse area. He tells off an employee who's violating like OSHA regulations or something because he's not wearing a weight belt and he's not wearing hard hats or something. And the guy's super intimidated. Yeah. And so, and then the scene caps off with a great conversation that Mike has with that guy's manager, basically just listing off every security flaw. There's blind spots in the cameras, and the people aren't.
You've got guys walking around without weight belts. You've got at least 17 blind spots in your camera system. This is unacceptable.
Well, that was a great impression. Yeah, that's exactly what it was like, and he's just telling this guy off like he owns the place, and this guy doesn't even know who he is, and he goes, Who are you?" And he goes, I'm Mike Ehrmantraut, security consultant."
I'm Mike Ehrmantraut, security consultant.
Exactly, and this guy's like, we don't have a security consultant." And I forget his response. It's something like, "Well, maybe you should," or something like that.
Yeah, or it's something like, "Excuse me, but I don't recall ever asking for the security consultant." Oh yeah, and then Mike says, "Why don't you call?" And I forget who he names.
Lydia.
Lydia. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
What do you think he's trying to accomplish? So I'll say during this whole scene, I guess even stepping back further, back to the guy with his son and when he's getting in the car. From that point forward, it was just about 10 minutes of me running through a billion scenarios about what is going on here. So first, when his car won't start, I was like, or even before that, as they're slowly zooming in and I see it's a bald guy, I was like, is that Hank? And then you hear his voice, and I'm like, it doesn't sound like Hank, okay? And then his car won't start, and I'm like, that car's about to explode. And I'm like, that doesn't really make any sense, okay? And then you figure out, okay, it's Mike. Mike is sneaking in. Okay, now why is he sneaking in? My initial thought is that he just wanted to check the place out. If he's using Madrigal to launder his money, he wants to make sure everything's on the up and up. But that feels like a lot of effort, and it sort of feels like he already has Gus Fring's trust, or he trusts Gus already to be a professional, and he's got everything buttoned up. So I don't know. Do you know what is he trying to accomplish here?
What I suspect is it's a combination of things, but ultimately what we know about his character is that he wants money for his granddaughter and his dead son's wife, his daughter-in-law, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think he knows, okay, Gus is involved in something big. Madrigal and Lydia, there's some huge criminal enterprise going on here. Mike's an expert at this stuff. He doesn't care that it's illegal. I think he wants a piece of it. I think he knows he'd be good at it. And I think part of him is just very curious. Like, how does this gigantic operation work, so well? And what can I do to make myself valuable? Because he just wants a lot of money.
Yeah, you're definitely right. He wants to impress Gus, Lydia, with his security skills, and then he gets a job. Though wasn't he already offered a job by them and he turned it down?
That's a good question. I don't remember.
Yeah, I guess we'll see how it plays out. But I think you're right that he's proving his skills in that area, and he'll get more money out of it. Right,
and I think we know that in the long run, he at least becomes pretty tight with Saul in that he's sort of he's kind of a cleanup guy, right? That's one of the first times we meet him is when he's cleaning up after Jane overdoses, and he kind of tells Jesse what to say.
Right. And I woke up, I saw her, that's all I remember.
Yeah, exactly. And we also know that he, let's see, I think he does end up working for Gus, and kind of I bet he's like on the payroll. He wants to be on the payroll rather than doing one-off gigs, I think, and I think he wants to be doing more important stuff rather than little kind of deals that might just end up putting him in danger.
Right. I'm going to note that down, though. I believe that he was actually offered a job by Gus previously, and he turned it down. So if that's true, then that just makes this a little bit more interesting or slightly more confusing. So I'm going to look into that after
and if that's true, either he changed his mind or he sees this as a negotiate. He denies it at first so he can show his worth and use it as a bargaining chip. Or maybe he wants a more important role than what he was offered. It's something we'll have to look into. So after that fun, we then jump to seeing this deal going on with Gus and Nacho. One second, a bunch of calendar events are about to go off on my phone and vibrate, so I'm just going to delay them for a sec. Okay. So moving on to the next scene, we see the aftermath of what happens when Hector Salamanca, also known as Uncle Tio, and Mr. Ding Ding Ding, has his stroke, which I'm sure becomes the event that makes him wheelchair bound. And I feel like I remember seeing Hector in a wheelchair, but also still able to talk. I could be wrong.
We need to get better about remembering this stuff before this whole episode. People are going to be saying like these two guys. It's like they've never even seen the show before. I think this happened, or what was the character's name again? But I agree with you. I think this was probably the event that put him in the wheelchair, lost him the ability to speak. I can't imagine they would. I mean, can you imagine them having this big episode dedicated to building up to this medical emergency event with Salamanca, and then they have to do it again to explain later on why he can't speak? So I think this has got to be the moment that turned that. And I'll say, Nacho is a great character because he's one of the few where we don't know his fate, especially in the Gus Mike side of the story. We know where Gus ends up. We know where Hector ends up. We know where Mike ends up. Nacho is really the one character where we can have true tension of, is he going to get away with this? And they did that great scene where Gus is on the phone and Nacho is slowly walking, trying to drop the pills into the sewage drain. And he's unsuccessful, isn't able to do it. But they're able to put a lot more tension into those scenes because of the Nacho character. So I think they did a great job creating that original character for this show.
Definitely, and they did a good job making us care about him because, again, just like a lot of these characters, he kind of reminds me of Jesse in the sense that his motivations are mixed. Yes, like ultimately he's probably not the greatest guy because he's involved in all the shady stuff, but he's trying to protect his dad from Hector. He's kind of stuck. It's not like he can just get out of all of this. And so he's kind of doing the logical thing here. He's trying to kill off Hector, which, he's threatening his family. Hector is not a good guy. And so you want his plan to work. And there is, like you said, legitimate, tension building because we don't know what will happen to him. We don't see him in Breaking Bad. Does he get killed? Does he make it out alive? Who knows?
Yeah. I'm betting on, here's another prediction. I think he doesn't survive the series.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't be surprised.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good scene. He's unable to drop the pills in the sewer drain. Gus informs Nacho that Nacho will be driving them somewhere, right?
Right.
I don't exactly remember where they're going.
They go to see the big boss of all the drug stuff.
Right.
And the boss basically tells Nacho, we're going to come get the delivery. The delivery is going to be on time like always. Basically, the bottom line is with Hector temporarily disabled, you need to make sure things run smoothly.
Right. So Nacho's kind of in charge now. And I wouldn't be surprised if Nacho didn't anticipate this. It's possible it didn't occur to him. There's going to be a power vacuum. What if they want me to fill in? Well, now everyone's going to... I think that's very suspicious, and people will easily suspect that Nacho had something to do with this because people will think he had a lot to gain from doing this.
Right. Is there anybody that would be mad about that, though?
I don't know.
He didn't want Gus to catch him, but if Gus did catch him, Gus is no fan of Hector. This only helps Gus. I don't get the impression that there's really many people out there that would have a problem with this.
Right.
So I think maybe word will get out, but people will be like, bro, nice job. And he's like, oh, I don't want to talk about this. Sorry, I have nothing to do with that. I'm like, okay, yeah, you had nothing to do with it. Sure.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone might have a reason to just turn a blind eye to it. Maybe things are more stable with Nacho in charge. And maybe Nacho's easier for Gus to manipulate. On top of that,
well, I definitely don't think they're not setting it up for stability because they have the conversation right after that one where the boss says everything's got to run smooth. Next scene, boss is talking to Gus and he says, what do you think? And he says, somebody's going to make a move against Hector now because there's a power vacuum, like you said. But maybe you're right. Maybe things end up more stable eventually, but at least in the short term, they're setting it up for some chaos.
Yeah, and I love Gus is such a good character, and every line he delivers is always so bone chilling. So he goes, and he says it in Spanish, but he says basically, Hector's stroke brings a power vacuum. A power vacuum brings chaos, and the chaos brings the DEA. It's
Chaos
very
brings the
ominous.
DEA. Yeah, I love that line. That was so good because he could have. I think any other show would have stopped at a power vacuum brings chaos. Better Call Saul takes it one step further. Chaos brings the DEA, which takes it from this grandiose like a power vacuum brings chaos, and then brings it back down to earth. And he's like, and chaos brings the DEA, which is bad for all of us.
Right.
It's
It's
just
very
funny, chilling. It was great.
very practical and concrete. It's like these are businessmen. They're trying to get stuff done, and he has very specific consequences that he's worried about. It's not like he's anti-chaos overall, or that he has some kind of strong moral compass about these abstract ideals. Even if he does, that's not what's going on. He's thinking about his business.
Right. Right.
And that's what's fun about this whole show, to me, is everything is very concrete. Like even little things as minor as Saul trying to just make enough money to move out of this massage or nail salon, or him trying to sell these commercial slots. It's like every little thing is a concrete point that a person has to deal with, whether it's a small thing like that or a big abstract thing like chaos and the concrete implication of it being the DEA.
Right. Speaking of those details, Mike quitting from his parking attendant or like guard job, right? When he has to hand back his windbreaker, right? That's another little detail, and it's they don't skip over any of the details. Like I frankly at this point didn't even remember that Mike was still working there, but they check the box and say we got to show him quitting, and they do a great job in this show of reflecting what the professional world is really like. Whenever Jimmy's in an office, it feels like a real office, as bland as a real office, not dramatized at all. And I've quit many jobs before. And there's always that awkward moment where you say bye to somebody and you know that you will never see that person again in your life. And that scene when Mike quits and he says bye to that guy, I forget his name. I've been there. I've been there so many times, and they perfectly captured what it's like. And you've already said bye that you usually have, or sometimes you have that one more awkward moment of like, oh, I need that windbreaker back. Or, oh, you can't keep that flash drive. You got to bring that back,
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and along the same lines as what you were just saying about how they don't glamorize anything. Like they don't make a law office look cool the way a lot of legal shows might do it. There's nothing about this show that makes being a lawyer look fun.
Yeah.
It's a job. It looks like a job just like any other with mountains of paperwork, and work in general isn't very fun. And this show, in that same sense, it's realistic because it doesn't skip over the concrete details that are really all that there really is to life.
Mm-hmm. Wow. All there is to life is the concrete details.
Exactly. That's what every moment is, and the show I think captures that pretty well. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the last we see this episode of Gus and that side of things. That whole sequence kind of caps off with Nacho alone disposing of the pills. He just throws it all into the river or water, whatever.
This was I'll just one admission here of just how sometimes you have these really stupid thoughts, and you're like, I shouldn't even tell anybody I thought that because it's so stupid. For some reason, when that scene started, I was like, oh, Nacho's gonna kill himself. that would have been hard to explain. Yeah. Yeah, it took me a second. I was like, no, that doesn't make any sense. Like, why would he go through all that trouble of making all that happen? And then so anyway, we can just gloss over that.
Yeah, well, I don't know what it says about you, but it is an interesting reaction, and I do find my mind is constantly trying to guess what's going to happen in the next second on the show, because they do a good job of building tension and setting up scenes in an ambiguous way at first. Mm-hmm. So after he throws those pills into the water, he seems pretty stressed and angry, which makes sense given all the events that just happened. The camera kind of goes to a different angle, and you realize that one of Gus's henchmen, Victor, who we see also in Breaking Bad, I think he suffers a pretty bad fate. Mm-hmm. I think Gus slits his throat with a box cutter.
Oh, that's the guy?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, because that's the guy. He shows up at Gail's apartment after Jesse already shot him.
Right. Oh,
And
that's
he's
why
like,
he looked so
people,
familiar. Yeah.
yeah, people saw Victor show up to the apartment acting kind of frantic to see what's going on, and then he just kind of runs away. And Gus is like, well, we can't have you walking around public anymore. And he slits his throat with a box cutter, and the blood gets all over Jesse and Walt. So that's one person's fate we can be sure about. But anyway, so Victor sees Nacho throw the pills into the water. Now, who knows what comes of that? Like, can Victor know that what was being thrown were pills? For all we know, Nacho picked up some trash off the ground and just because he felt pissed off and wanted to throw something. So I don't think it's, who knows how important it is, what just happened. For all we know, it could just say, like, Gus's eye is on Nacho now, and he's going to be under surveillance for a while.
Right. Yeah, I think this is just, it would have been too clean if Nacho just got away with this. So I think they're setting this up for, the walls closing in this season on Nacho, and we're going to watch him and see how does he get away with all this and get through all this. Though I still have that question of what are the consequences if Victor figures out what happened and Gus finds out what happened? Is he mad at Nacho? What happens from that?
Right. Is he mad or is he impressed?
Right.
I remember there were points in Breaking Bad where it seemed like Gus was actually getting kind of impressed with Jesse's performance at things. Like, Mike would work with Jesse and to get him clean, and Mike would kind of report back to Gus what Jesse's been up to, and they staged some attack that Jesse could kind of fight off to build his own confidence. But there were things that happened that it seemed like Gus took a shine to him, and for all we know, it's a similar thing that's happening with Nacho.
Right. Gus has a weird thing with Hector, though. Right. He has a past with him, and he has a personal vendetta against Hector. And I could see him, and I feel like we've seen elements of Gus being like, he's mine, or he's mine to kill and get revenge on. So that's where I could see him having something against Nacho, making a move against Hector.
That's a really good point. I didn't even think about that, but you're completely right. He wants Hector alive so he can torture him indefinitely.
Yeah, that's sort of the one thing Gus gets personal about.
Yeah, totally. And that's a really good point. So it's funny. I didn't think about that, but as all this stuff is unfolding, the main thing that could be on Gus's mind is, I hope he didn't die.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's one of the things I'm most curious to see how it plays out. Like, I find this whole Gus plot in the way it involves Mike and Nacho, like, I just love that stuff, and it's something from Breaking Bad that everyone wanted to know more about. Everyone wanted to know more about Gus's backstory. Everyone wanted to know more about Madrigal, because it's just this huge criminal element that we know nothing about. So I'm really curious to see how everything happens with that.
That's the next spin-off. It's like John Wick. They're doing the spin-off TV series that's all about the hotel and the whole underground, like society of assassins. Then they're also doing a spin-off of Jason Bourne. I think it's called Touchstone, where it's all about the organization. So that's the next Breaking Bad spin-off is Madrigal.
If they just end up doing like a Russian doll spin-off thing for the next 50 years in this universe, I will be more than happy with that. Because what we're seeing like over the past maybe decade is they're bringing back all these old franchises and movies, and they're making sequels to stuff that we never thought there'd be sequels for. Maybe the new thing like that is going to be, we're going to start seeing spin-offs of everything. It's about to happen with Game of Thrones too.
Yeah, they've all been terrible though, except for Better Call Saul.
True.
Oh yeah, and Fuller House.
That was not terrible.
We move on from that.
Okay. All right, so we're nearing the end of the episode. We see the funeral happening. We don't really see very much of it, but we see Chuck's funeral. It's full of people. They're all, giving their condolences to Jimmy. Jimmy seems not particularly moved, but again, we don't know exactly what he's feeling. But they don't linger on the funeral for very long. I don't think there's too much to say about that scene.
A few cameo appearances from characters from past seasons that I would list out if we were better prepared. But one that I recognized, forget his name, but the guy that was Jimmy's boss for a little bit, that kind of hippie-ish or cooler guitar playing boss, he showed up for a second. Chuck's wife, I think you only see her in the background. But that was the one thing. I remember that there were... it was interesting that they didn't choose to have... You would think any other show would have the eulogy. You'd see people speaking. But I guess they felt like they didn't really need to. We already had the scene of the obituary being read to Jimmy. So I guess they felt, what more needs to be said here?
Right. So they kind of gloss over the obituary. They gloss over the funeral. And in the end, the show is not about Chuck. It's about Jimmy. And maybe the fact that they're glossing over it, it could be just efficiency-wise. You only have so much time in the episode, and we know what happens. We've seen a million funeral scenes in TV and movies. It could also be saying something about how this is, not this kind of stuff, going over Chuck's past and recalling his achievements or mourning him. Jimmy's not in that place either, maybe. And I think in the scene immediately after this, we get a hint that might be true. Jimmy's not particularly moved by all of these remembrances for Chuck, his obituary, the funeral. Maybe the show glosses over them because Jimmy mentally or emotionally is sort of glossing over it too. And I think there is some supporting evidence of that. Like, one of the only clues we get about Jimmy's inner feelings is what happens in the next scene, which is Howard sits down with Jimmy and Kim after the funeral, I think back at Jimmy's house. And in a very rare moment for Howard of more emotion, we see him on the verge of tears, and I think he does cry a little bit, saying he thinks that it was his fault that Chuck killed. Well, first of all, he says, I don't think it was an accident. I think Chuck killed himself, right? Which I think to us it was obvious because we already knew that, but it makes sense that no one really talks about it out loud yet, and so it could be this kind of elephant in the room. And Howard's reasoning is Chuck was always very careful with his lanterns, and he also knew that Chuck was in really bad shape those last couple days because Howard drove him out of the firm with the malpractice rate issue being sort of the last straw. And I don't think it was about money. I just think it was like Howard knows that he can't, that this is bad for the company, and ultimately he's responsible for keeping the company on track. So we see Howard going over all this stuff that he's been thinking about, and not only does he think that Chuck actually killed himself, but he also thinks that it's all his fault. And Jimmy's reaction is pretty interesting.
That's your cross to bear.
Exactly.
So something like that. Yeah, and then he just gets up and he's like, I'm going to make myself some tea. Anybody want some?
Yeah. Yeah, and that took me by surprise. I didn't know what to expect from Jimmy's reaction, like, because in my emotional state, I'm watching it and I'm like, I feel bad for Howard. Like, it's completely not his fault, and my immediate reaction is like I want to reassure him and tell him, like, you couldn't control this. He was sick, and like, this is definitely not your fault. And you would think, you kind of feel like that's what Jimmy's going to do, just because that's what any normal person would do. And his reaction is just totally off from what I was thinking.
Yeah. I'll say I don't think Jimmy's glossing over his emotions, because there was one scene earlier that we didn't really talk a whole lot about. When Jimmy and Kim are back in the house, there's a scene where Kim pours out 2 glasses of whiskey, I guess. And Jimmy is basically sitting there almost catatonic, doesn't even react to her, so she ends up drinking it. The scene fades to Kim sleeping on the couch and Jimmy in the exact same position, implying he was sitting there all night. So that's not what somebody does if they're not in a dark place. So I do think he was moved by it. I mean, even if it was just him sort of feeling completely empty and just not knowing how to deal with it. I have a couple thoughts on what the reaction might have been at the end of the episode. Why all of a sudden is he unnaturally chipper? One, a lot of times, if somebody commits suicide, people will view that as almost a selfish act, and they'll actually get angry. And I could see Jimmy viewing Chuck's suicide as one more, like, of course he's taking this so seriously, like it's the end of the world because you're getting maybe pushed out of your law firm, and then also Jimmy in some weird way could see Chuck doing this as or maybe even if not Chuck, but the universe is trying to make Jimmy feel guilty for what he thinks is probably not that big a deal. So I could see this just being a very visceral reaction of just maybe anger, maybe of course it was a suicide. Yeah, that was kind of my read on it. I think it's complicated, and it's intentionally complicated and ambiguous, but there might be some of that going on.
Right. Yeah, I think you make some very good points, especially about him being sort of catatonic. I think I forgot to consider that, and I agree with you. I think probably he's in a little bit of he probably has a lot of mixed emotions, but ultimately is feeling something very strongly, something bad, and it maybe is sort of dissociating a little bit and not as present because of all the stuff that's going on. And I think some of the reasoning you just gave for his reaction there makes a lot of sense. One added little thing is also, I think he probably is not a huge fan of Howard's. It's no big deal to him if Howard feels guilty about it. Maybe Jimmy doesn't care, or maybe he doesn't like. I know he doesn't like Howard very much, so maybe it's like, okay, well, if Howard's going to beat himself up over it, I'm not going to stop him.
Yeah. What I love about this show is that I think in some shows you wouldn't have another character confront Jimmy and say, "What the hell are you doing? Like, you don't care about Chuck all of a sudden? How could you treat Howard that way?" I guess most shows would have that conversation. I guess I'm not giving them enough credit, but I fully expect next episode for Kim to confront Jimmy, and we'll hear something from him that hopefully gives us some clue into what he's going through, how he's processing all of this.
I hope so, and I can't wait to find out. Any closing thoughts?
I'll just say, one thing I wanted to mention is the music in this episode, or the score in this episode, was fantastic. If you want a good example of it, go back to, I believe it was the scenes where Jimmy and Kim get to Chuck's house. The score was sort of haunting, reminded me for some reason of Blade Runner 2049. Might be biased because I was listening to that score all day before watching the episode. But if you're out there, give it a listen. Tell me if you hear that similarity as well. But once I heard that, I couldn't stop noticing it throughout the episode. It was an excellent score. Great opening for season 4. It reminded me why I love this show. It's taking characters and just puts them under a magnifying glass. There are no other shows out there, at least for that I've seen, that are all about character study. I mean, there's interesting plot happening, but this show is great because we're slowly peeling back the layers of Jimmy McGill. We're watching him slowly transform. It's taking its time. It's so interesting. As you and I, we're in suspense, not because, partially because we want to see what happens with Nacho and Gus, but I want to know, I'm in suspense to find out what's Jimmy's emotional, mental state. I mean, that says something about just how great this show is.
Right. And I think one way to really emphasize what's different about this show is it really is about the journey and not the destination, because we know the destination. Not only do we know that the destination from Breaking Bad, but we also know what happens to him somewhat after Breaking Bad, that he ends up running a Cinnabon in Omaha, just like he said he would. And so the great suspense of the show is we know point A and we know point B. What we want to know is, how does he get there? Mm-hmm. And it's a ton of fun to watch. And I don't know any other show that has done something like this other than Breaking Bad in a way. Or any other show that's played with identity this much. What you see in Breaking Bad is like there are multiple names for Walter, and we actually talk about him as being multiple people. We have Walter, we have Heisenberg, right? and it really feels like he becomes a different person through the show, a completely different person. And we know like that's going to happen with Saul too. Like the way Jimmy is now, he has a lot in common with Saul, but there's a lot of transformation that needs to happen before he gets to becoming Saul. And we also know he's going to become Gene.
Right. So this show ups the ante from Breaking Bad because now we have 3 alter egos.
Exactly. And with that, I'll ask you, better than Breaking Bad?
Yes.
I have to agree.